Hello, everyone. Loremaster of Sotek here, and today we'll be continuing our little journey through the oh-so-beloved end times. After wrapping up the Cornate Bloodbath for Book 5, the time has come to focus on furrier subjects as we wind the clock back to Book 4. The penultimate entry for the apocalypse is none other than End Times Thanquol, which heavily featured the Skaven as the main protagonists. From the dense jungles of Lustria to the streets of Nuln, the Ratmen rose up to fulfill the Horned Rat's fell promise of inheriting the surface world. This, of course, led to several shenanigans, including the Chaos Moon Morsalib exploding to rain down on the planet. But we're here to discuss the new characters and units that appeared alongside the book. When the Skaven's initial attempt to conquer the world during the early stages of the End Times failed, due to stiff resistance and typical infighting, the wiser leaders among the Ratmen came to realize that they needed assistance. Not only would devastating new shock troops be required, but demonic horrors beyond mortal comprehension. With this new swarm of reinforcements, the Horned Rat's will could no longer be denied. So let's step in and see which of these entities might be coming to total war and what they'll do. The first of these new baddies to be unleashed came about through sheer Skaven ingenuity and the evolution of science. Since the days of the Black Plague in 1111 or 1111 of the Imperial calendar, the flesh crafters of Clan Moulder had reached the ultimate expression of their art in the form of rat ogres, powerful brutes able to be augmented with experimental grafts and capable of tearing through most enemies in their frenzied rampages. This catapulted Clan Moulder to truly claim the title of a great clan, where they remained until the end of all things. However, for over 1,000 years, the Master Moulders sought to improve on their creations, ever seeking to improve upon those methods that had come before. Yet every result met with failure, as the creatures they made were either utterly uncontrollable, even by the lacking standards of Skaven, or proved to be inferior at dealing death. This led to instead attempting to improve the Rat Ogre itself, which had limited success. Mutant and Bonebreaker Rat Ogres were larger in size, with impressive augmentations, but required far more investment for not much gain. This finally changed thanks to the obsessive efforts of Throt the Unclean, the infamous Master Moulder responsible for the creation of the Hell Pit abominations. While those colossal mounds of shambling flesh had proven quite successful, they were unable to be produced in large quantities like the Rat Ogres, and were difficult to control. Thus, as the opening stages of the End Times began and the Skaven Under Empire surged up from below to assault almost the entire world, Throt instead experimented within his nightmarish workshops. He had a particular goal in mind, that being to improve the Rat Ogre design by making the creature far more intelligent. This would allow the brutes to take orders far more effectively, be able to avoid obvious traps, and perhaps even become capable of wielding weaponry. The initial experiments proved problematic, as rat ogres were near impossible to subdue, which meant performing brain surgeries or mutation with the beast simply chained down. Those survivors of the demanding procedure unfortunately disappointed Throt, as he discovered that the increased intelligence led to decreased aggression, which was, of course, unacceptable. So, the Master Moulder altered his approach. Perhaps instead of making the beast smarter, he could simply attach their packmasters directly to them. This way, the Rat Ogre and Handler would be one being, able to act in concert. The packmaster able to direct the creature instantly by being part of its very nervous system. Initially, this path manifested incredible results, as packmasters who were chosen to be permanently stitched into the back of a Rat Ogre, their brains and vital fluids directly connected, were indeed able to control them to an impressive degree. This itself became an issue, however, as the understandably upset controlling minds used their over-muscled, hulking mauler beasts to express their discontent and rampage around Hellpit. The experiments had to be cancelled immediately, and left with no genuine volunteers, Throt came to the conclusion that he would simply have to grow them himself. Thus did the Master Mutator use gruesome techniques to create the subjects he needed, and merged other parts with captives and slaves. The result was a batch of scrawny and submissive Skaven with unusually large brains. Sounds like a couple of you listening to this video, haha, I kid. Once permanently integrated into a warpstone-powered harness rigged with coils and tubes, the controlling Skaven's body would become even more atrophied. Eventually, all that would remain was little more than a shriveled husk with an auxiliary brain that would help steer the savage brute with which it was melded. Throt had at last succeeded. These new rat ogres were just as ferocious, but could be briefly controlled by the grotesque creatures fused onto their backs. However, it was at this point that the development of this new shock troop reached an impasse. While the rat ogres were now capable of wielding weaponry, Clan Moulder found itself woefully lacking in anything appropriate to arm them with. Enormous clubs and oversized blades were taken from defeated ogre tribes, but these proved little more effective than traditional claws and augments for rat ogres. Outside help would be required, and the powers that be within Hellpit knew there was one clan above all others that could provide the weapons they needed: Skreech. Fortunately for Throt, his arrival into Skaven Blight to request said aid could not have been timed better. Clan Skreech desired stronger support from the other great clans, in pursuit of building enough support to overthrow the Greyseer's clan. As such, Lord Morskatar, the ruler of Clan Skreech, had given explicit instructions to assist Clan Moulder in every way to improve relations. As it turned out, Ikit Claw had been busy between his other projects developing powerful, though flawed, new weapons. The chief warlock had attempted to upgrade the various devices carried by weapon teams, but each design proved too difficult for the teams to even carry, much less lift or aim. Although Ikit himself despised collaborating with others, especially the foul-smelling wretches of Clan Moulder, he nonetheless had been looking for a way to get back in Lord Morskatar's good graces after several setbacks. So did the greatest geniuses of two of the most scientific clans combine their efforts to create the perfect new soldiers for the apocalypse. It didn't take long for the improved rat ogres to be kitted out with new weapons. Ikit had sulked to begin with, but as each technical issue was resolved, he started to realize the potential of this project. The hulking brutes were able to bear incredibly heavy weapons, capable of carrying multiple guns along with the necessary ammunition feeds or warp generator power sources. Throt also proved an exceptional partner despite Ikit's initial dismissal. The Master Moulder sawed off bits of arm bone to allow the attachment of Warpforged gauntlets, or increased the rate of brain juice transference to better allow the auxiliary brain to guide its brawny teammate. It was Throt who suggested an automatic cutoff mechanism on the Ratling cannons, as it had proven impossible to get the Rat Ogre to stop firing, resulting in them using up all of their ammunition in one sustained spray of bullets. The end result of all this experimentation were the unstoppable shock troops that were dubbed as Stormfiends. These rat ogres were first deployed when the Skaven overran Talea in 2523 of the Imperial calendar to devastating effect, obliterating all attempts at organized resistance and spelling doom for the southern nations of men. They would not see full rollout until notably later in roughly 25-26, when the Stormfiends finally were capable of being mass-produced enough to appear in both the Lustrian and World's Edge Mountains theaters of war. Their impact on the conflicts cannot be understated, especially against the dwarfs, who found the monstrosities to be powerful foes indeed. Stormfiends come in a staggering assortment of variations, whether designed for close quarters combat or ranged warfare. We'll start with the different melee versions seen across the battlefields of the end times, and then move on to those that fired from afar. All of these weapons, bar one, were made from Warpstone or utilize it, making their attacks magical in nature. Some of Thrott's Stormfiends were adapted to carry warp grinders, allowing them to create their own tunnels by vaporizing soil, rock, and roots alike. Once in combat, such a Stormfiend will grind at the foe, disintegrating flesh with ease. Known as grinder fists, these weapons were equipped onto the chest and both arms, allowing the Rat Ogre to prove nearly impossible to dodge as small bolts of warp lightning lashed out at nearby foes. Similar to regular warp grinders, they likely would have the ability to disrupt enemies' attempts at movements in Total War, utilizing various abilities, in addition to having high armor piercing and things of that nature. Next are the more heavily armored Stormfiends, those that required substantial power to operate their weapons, and thus had to be encased within warpstone-laced armor that also provided substantially better protection. By attaching huge motorized iron balls and whirling blades onto the ends of a Stormfiend's arms, a truly fearsome tunnel fighter was created. To further protect these close combat maulers, they bear heavy armor adorned with spinning clever blades. The Doomflayer gauntlets provide devastatingly augmented strength and ensure the Stormfiend's charge will be horrific in power. The final melee variant is the deeply feared Shock Gauntlets. For the ultimate in shock assaults, Stormfiends armed with electrified gauntlets were produced by Clan Skreech. Powered by warp generators, it is the heavy armor the beast wears that is the true weapon, for it conducts arcs of warp lightning that wreath the Rat Ogre's body in crackling energies. Simply being near one of these creatures is enough to sizzle many foes to a burnt crisp. Rather uniquely, this is the only Stormfiend variant that has no weapon team's counterpart. The Shock Gauntlets not only increase the strength of the Rat Ogre, though not as much as the Doomflayer Gauntlets, but utterly ignore armor, as each strike unleashes powerful bolts of warp lightning no mundane metal or leather can hope to stop. They also deal consistent damage to those too close, as smaller but still deadly bolts arc outwards from the warpstone-laced armor itself. When considering the Doomflayer gauntlets, obviously they are based on Doomflayers, so I would see them having melee damage reflection to show how they have the spinning, whirling blades on their armor that's supposed to protect them. Very high charge bonus, probably the highest charge bonus of the Stormfiend variants. High armor piercing, and I would also personally think a built-in anti-infantry bonus would be fairly appropriate. When looking at the Shock Gauntlets, I imagine a unit that relies more on damage over time, though I could see them perhaps being one of those units that while they're in combat, they're able to build up charges that maybe cause a little zap of warp lightning to hit around them. Sort of if you think like the Stegadon Regiment of Renown, the Engine of the Gods Regiment of Renown, where, no, it's not an Engine of the Gods, but it runs into battle and has lightning zap around it as it's in battle. Maybe something similar for this version of the Stormfiends, where they're a little smaller and less devastating as they're not a Regiment of Renown, but little bolts of warp lightning strike around them, or perhaps they have a bound use of warp lightning, or maybe they're able to deal some very minor damage over time around them. Moving on, next come the ranged variants, none of which possess the heavier armor. Some Stormfiends bear paired wind launcher mortar fists. Mundane armor offers no protection against the vapors released by the poisoned wind globes lobbed into the fray by these weapons. With each shot, a new glass orb filled with gaseous death clicks into position, ready to be fired. The Stormfiend wind launcher is identical to the poison wind mortar weapon, though obviously far more capable of defending itself in melee and able to reposition much easier. When it comes to pumping out sheer firepower, there is little that can match a Stormfiend equipped with rattling cannons. 3 sets of 8-barreled weapons bedeck this hulking muscle beast, enabling it to pour forth warp bullets which riddle entire enemy units with holes. The rattling cannons are more powerful than the smaller rattling guns, but otherwise operate identically in that they are a medium to short range unit that fire a vast number of bullets, would have suppression fire, and would be fairly inaccurate, but capable of dealing devastating damage if set up properly. Finally, Stormfiends armed with warp fire projectors wade into battle, shooting arcs of green-black warp fire from their heavy gauntlets. While these great cones of unnatural flame might occasionally miss their target, it is a small price to pay for the devastation even a single shot can wreak upon enemy regiments. Similar to the other weapons, the warp fire projectors are identical to the warp fire throwers in how they fire and function. So you could see that with the ranged variants, they tend to be far simpler, but come with a very easy to understand advantage of being far more capable of defending themselves in melee, having at least some light armor, and able to maneuver and position easier and cause fear, which is nice. Whereas the melee variants are a bit more complicated. That wraps up the Stormfiend's weapon variants, but there are a small number of additional notes for these absolute brutes that are worth noting. While they are similar to rat ogres in regards to causing fear, by almost every other metric, the Stormfiends are an outright improvement. They're very lightly armored, minus the Shock Gauntlet and Doomflayer Gauntlet versions, which are very heavily armored. And the Stormfiends are also far more skilled in combat. Better baseline melee attack, melee defense, armor, and leadership, with also improved weapon strength on the melee variants. Their only downside is that they lack frenzy, but the improved stats is designed to compensate for that. When it comes to examining them through a Total War lens, the Stormfiends are without a doubt the most complicated unit in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy. On tabletop, each individual Stormfiend in a unit of them could be given a different weapon, allowing for an obscene amount of combinations to appear on the battlefield. Total War could simplify it to having only a melee and ranged variant, all the way up to having 6 unique variants, each equipped with a different weapon. I don't have much of an opinion myself, to be honest, on what would be the best combination, other than pure curiosity of seeing how Creative Assembly will handle it. That finally wraps up the Skaven Shock Troop. So let's turn our attention to the demonic overlords lurking in the shadows. Next, of course, is the revitalized Verminlords, the demons of the Horned Rat, who lurk within the realm of ruin until they can be summoned forth into reality. During the end times, the iconic monstrosities would go from being a simpler system of Verminlords and exalted Verminlords to a complex set of varieties depicting different aspects of Skaven culture. Within the story of the end times, they appeared all over the world, first arriving in Skavenblight to advise the Grey Seers in their schemes to draw the Chaos Moon Morsalib closer to the planet. When this disastrous plan would be successfully averted by the Slawn Mage Priests of Lustria at great cost, the swelling of magic it ultimately resulted in allowed for the demons to appear in vast numbers. From 2525 of the Imperial calendar onwards, the course of the Skaven's war to conquer the world turned strongly in their favor, as the demons threw their weight behind the various factions. The Lustrian theater saw the arrival of the strongest among the pestilent reapers, a Verminlord corruptor known as Verminlords, who guided Lord Skreech in unleashing such horrific plagues that the jungles themselves rotted away into a land of sludge and endless swarms of vermin. In Carrick 8 Peaks, the three-way war would finally be brought to an end thanks to the scheming of a Lord of Assassins, the Verminlord deceiver Lurklocks, that aligned himself with Queek Headtaker. Plus, one of the great manipulators, a Verminlord Warpseer called Soothgnawer, that ultimately removes Skarsnik from the equation, as it sought to restore the disgraced Greyseer clan to power. Finally, of note in the World's Edge Mountains, there appeared the Tyrant of Battles, an unnamed Verminlord Warbringer, who dealt High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer a devastating wound in the closing of 2527 of the Imperial calendar, before it was vanquished by a strike from the Axe of Grimnir. If anyone wants more detailed specifics about all of the Verminlord variants, I'll include a link you can click down below to the Lorebeards episode, where Andy Law and I discuss them in depth, including the ones that predate the End Times variants. When looking at the Demons of the Horned Rat through a Total War lens, it is quite likely they'll copy the other greater demons, and that will receive one version to represent the regular Verminlord, while another will represent the exalted version. As for which it will be, there's no guarantee, but I personally suspect it will be the Warbringer for the regular Verminlord, and the Warpseer for the exalted Verminlord. The reason for this is that the Deceiver and Corruptor are very clan-specific, representing Clan Eshin and Clan Pestilence, respectively, while the other two that I mentioned earlier are much more neutral to kind of all the clans. That being said, for the sake of this video, I'll give each a brief description of how they could work in Total War. When establishing a baseline, all the Verminlords cause terror, are immune to psychology, powerful wizards, and excellent combatants. They're also demonic, so magical attacks with demonic instability rather than fleeing from combat, and they have a decent baseline defense thanks to that built-in physical resistance. I'll start with the Verminlord versions that I think are not likely to make it into the game, and then we'll go from there. First up is my personal favorite, the Colors of Civilization, the Pestilent Reapers, known as the Verminlord Corruptors. When it comes to the various demon rats, these emaciated monsters bring the most pure offense in close combat. Wielding dual Plague Reapers, which are hand scythes that emphasize speed and an anti-infantry focus, they also have unique access to Frenzy as just a baseline special rule, which dials them up to 11. Finally, each of the Verminlords specializes in a particular spell, which for the Corruptor is obviously Plague. If it were to be brought into the game, I suspect it would be given bound versions of all the spells from the lore of Plague, similar to how the generic greater demons get bound spells from their own respective lores. Next up are the Shadows That Kill, the Lords of Assassins, known as the Verminlord Deceivers. These stealthy murderers rely on a special gimmick known as Shrouded in Darkness, which would provide them with improved missile resistance. Furthermore, they are the only Verminlord with a ranged attack from their Doom Star, a gigantic throwing star that is poisoned, armor-piercing, and well-designed to slice through ranks of enemies. In combat, they utilize a Warp Stiletto, which does grant poisoned attacks. When it comes to magic, I imagine they would have full access to bound spell versions of the entire lore of stealth. On, then, to one of the variants I would expect to see actually make it into Total War Warhammer. In this case, for the generic Verminlord, we have the Great Stabber Slicers, the Tyrants of Battle, known as the Verminlord Warbringers. These masterminds at close combat warfare actually wear a fair bit of armor compared to their demonic kin, and wield a brutal combination of weapons. They simultaneously make use of the immense Doomglaive, while also lashing out with a punch dagger jutting out from one of their gauntlets. These brutes would bring extremely high armor-piercing damage into the equation, and should actually, in my opinion, have anti-large and anti-infantry, as they had both special rules that translated into those from tabletop. Though I could see them instead just being given high stats overall, with no specific focus for anti-infantry or anti-large, I should say, as Creative Assembly rarely grants both modifiers like that as a baseline. For magic, I would see them having the lore of ruin in the form of bound spells. Finally, there's the version that would probably suit best for the Exalted Verminlord option. The Lords of Black Lightning, the Great Manipulators, known as the Verminlord Warpseers. The most powerful version, due to a frankly absurd unique item that they had known as the Scry Orb. Pondering this black orb grants the Verminlord considerably buffed defenses, either granting them a ward save or just increasing their physical resistance. However, there is a secondary function to the Scry Orb. The Verminlord can choose to hurl it into an enemy, where it will shatter and suck everything around it into the realm of chaos. In tabletop, this was an instant kill attack if you failed to dodge it. But in Total War, it would probably end up being a more reasonable ability to maybe spawn a vortex attack that deals significant armor-piercing damage, for instance. I would love to see it truly mirror the tabletop, in that it is a once per battle use ability. You can only use it once, and if you do use it, it should disable a passive defense buff that you would have before using it. On the combat side of things, they also wield a Doomglaive, though they don't have the punch dagger. So I imagine the Verminlord Warpseer having a solid armor piercing and maybe anti-large focus for their attacks. So maybe you could have it where the Warbringer is anti-infantry and the Warpseer is anti-large, I guess. Finally, as they'd be a Lord choice, in my opinion, when it comes to their spells, I think the option should be that when you choose to recruit one, they can either take from the lore of Ruin or they can take from the lore of Pestilence. They could be given the lore of Stealth as an option as well. I mean, it would make sense, as the Warpshears should have access to all Skaven magic. I will note, though, I do think they should have a unique bound version of Warp Lightning you can get from their skill tree, because Warp Lightning is the spell they were associated with. If they cast it, they were always supposed to have it, and when they did cast it, they could like re-roll the dice to make it extra effective. I will say, though, before I move on from the Verminlord variants, there is what I would say moderately unhinged option that Creative Assembly could do if they wanted to be extra spicy, which is that Verminlords are confirmed in the End Times lore to be both demon princes and fully created by the Great Horned Rat, in the sense that some of them the gods simply just created, which is how traditional demons and greater demons are come about. But some of them, most of them that we actually get to see, are actually mortal Skaven that were elevated to demonhood. So hypothetically, you could do a system where instead of just having one exalted Verminlord, you could have it where you cannot recruit any exalted Verminlords, and instead your regular generals, if they reach the appropriate level, could choose to ascend to a Verminlord. And I think that actually would allow them to have all the different variants without it feeling like bloat. So your Grey Seer would evolve into a Verminlord Warp Seer. Your Warlords would evolve into Verminlord Warbringers. Your Master Assassins would evolve into Verminlord Deceivers. And then we would have to, at some point, get our hands on a Plague Lord or some kind of Plague Pontifex or a Clan Pestilence Lord level character, which I do think we should get anyway, but that's for a separate video, who could evolve into a Verminlord Corruptor. That would be pretty cool, but they also might decide they don't want to do that and just want to treat them like traditional demons, which would also be fine. Anywho, with those out of the way, that leaves us with the last demonic abomination, the one and only Rat King. Skreech Verminking is the absolute pinnacle of the Verminlords, the entity that stands beside the Great Horned Rat. While the demons of the Horned Rat can be either creations of the ruinous god or mortal Skaven ascended to immortality, Skreech is quite the unique case. Long ago, well before the birth of Sigmar's empire, the world stood upon the brink of annihilation as the great necromancer Nagash prepared to unleash his great ritual. The planet would have been drowned beneath endless legions of undeath, but at the last moment, the Skaven would save the living. For the first time in their history, the Council of 13 managed to settle on a unanimous vote to try and stop Nagash, unleashing the full potential of their ruinous race. In spite of the odds, the Skaven successfully caused a series of events that struck down the godlike sorcerer, though in the process, several of the Lords of Decay were killed. The Great Horned Rat watched his children with pride, seeing the Skaven finally unify to defeat a mighty foe even the dark gods were incapable of stopping. Yet, instead of taking advantage and sweeping up to dominate the surface world ripe for the taking, the remaining Council of 13 immediately resumed their squabbling and backstabbery. Rage swelled within the god of ruin, and so he reached out his claw and claimed the remaining Lords of Decay. He cast their souls into a deep pit within the realm of ruin to await his judgment, alongside those that had been slain by Nagash, who themselves were waiting for a reward. There they remained for an impossible length of time, in a space where time holds no meaning, fed only the scraps of failed plots. Centuries passed in the mortal realms until at last the horned god relented, reaching into the pit and drawing forth what remained of his disgraced children. Yet what emerged from that black prison was not 12 Lords of Decay. Instead, a single hideous amalgamation. melded into a squirming nightmare with their tails all interlocked. The entire Council of 13 now existed as one grotesque entity. The Horned Rat looked over his new creation and deemed it unfinished, striking it with a searing bolt of black lightning to reshape its form into one more pleasing to his eyes, that of a Verminlord, and with a final vomitous belch anointed it with a portion of his godly power. Thus did Skreech Verminking arise from a baptism of filth and decay. Possessing all the talents, knowledge, and abilities from the 12 Lords of Decay that comprised his being, Lord Verminking is unrivaled among the servants of the Horned Rat. Since his demonic rebirth, he has orchestrated events from the shadowy realm of ruin until at last the end times provided opportunity. It was Skreech who ordered the Verminlords to cease hiding within the ether, urging them to manifest into reality where possible and guide the Skaven. In his case, he waited until his selected pawn summoned him into reality. One Grey Seer Thanquol. Skreech Verminking is quite likely to appear in Total War Warhammer as a universal legendary hero for the Skaven, an ultimate expression of the Verminlords. In matters of strength and combat, Skreech possesses the unique combination of a Doomglaive and Plague Reaper, allowing him to mix devastating damage with lightning-fast strikes. A mixture of anti-large and anti-infantry, perhaps, or at least a notably improved melee attack to represent the enhancements granted from the Plague Reaper. Furthermore, he should have access to a bound version of the dreaded 13th spell, as he is its true master, along with a mixture of spells from the lores of Ruin, Plague, and Stealth. His original tabletop profile in the end times actually isn't really that impressive compared against the other Verminlords due to some odd quirks regarding his rules. But in Total War, he'll be able to stand a full head above his brethren. With that, the time for our final stop has arrived. The titular rat himself, Grey Seer Thanquol, and his monstrous bodyguard, Boneripper. Thanquol has long been a villain in the Warhammer world, proving to be an exceptional menace to quite literally everyone around him, whether they were men, dwarfs, or even Skaven. From his bitter rivalry against the duo of Gotrek and Felix, to chaotic missions around the world in service to the Council of 13, the Grey Seer had built up quite the reputation. Blessed with an uncanny sixth sense, or perhaps just divine protection, he managed to survive the most deadly of situations, and always bounced back from what should have been disastrous failures. During the opening stages of the end times, Thanquol had benefited highly from the Great Uprising. Returning victorious from Talea in roughly 2523, with countless slaves and coffers full of loot, only to discover that Seer Lord Kritislik, master of the Grey Seer's clan Scrutin and Lord of Decay, had been killed by the Horned Rat himself. While this obvious disparagement from their god left Thanquol a tad nervous, the now open seat on the Council of 13 was far too tempting to ignore. Initially, Thanquol attempted to rally his fellow Grey Seers, only to be immediately exiled and nearly killed as they refused to endure his presence any longer. So, he instead went and sold his services to Clan Skreich, orchestrating a plot that saw the Warlock engineers successfully plant a bomb within the bell tower of the Horned Rat. The ensuing detonation killed quite a few Grey Seers and utterly derailed all of his rivals' attempts to reclaim power. In the meantime, near the end of 2524 of the Imperial calendar, the Grey Seer found himself assigned to attend Great Warlock Skrubalt, the clan Skryre leader placed in charge of destroying the Empire city of Nuln. It quickly became apparent that Thanquol's actual role was to be the scapegoat, blamed for everything that went wrong amid the countless schemes playing out beneath the city. Realizing that this could only lead to his death, Thanquol fled into a quiet tunnel of the sewers and performed a summoning ritual. Fortunately for him, this time he succeeded and outstrode the mighty Skreech Verminking. The first gift that the Ascendant Greyseer received from his new patron was a new hulking bodyguard. For decades, Thanquol had always been accompanied by a rat ogre named Boneripper, though there had actually been 12 such brutes over the years. Each time one died, he simply acquired a new one and granted it the exact same name, with the 13th being no different. What was different, however, was the 13th Boneripper was no mere rat ogre. Lord Verminking had used his unparalleled knowledge of dark sorcery and flesh crafting to shape the largest beast ever seen that could still be technically called a rat ogre. Upon arms swollen with muscle, Boneripper could be equipped with either improved warpfire projectors to unleash waves of scorching black-green flame, or spiked warpfire braziers that would pulverize and burn anything within reach. So large was this new bodyguard that instead of cowering behind his guardian, Thanquol could now scamper up its back and ride it into battle. With the open support of the terrifying Skreech Verminking, Thanquol swiftly usurped control of the Nuln operation, and over the course of several short months, brought the jewel of the Empire to utter ruin. From here, he would skitterleap around the globe at the side of his Verminlord ally to witness several events, such as the devastation of Lustria and the death of High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer. After observing the world being brought to its knees beneath the Skaven onslaught, the Greyseer would be selected by Skreech to bear the head of Thorgrim to the Council of 13, which granted him the right to claim the empty seat. Thus did he ascend from Greyseer to Lord of Decay. From here, Thanquol would be chosen to act as the council's representative when he joined Verminking one final time to meet with Archaon the Everchosen, joining the children of the Horned Rat to the Legions of Chaos for the conclusion of the end times. When looking at end times Thanquol and Boneripper through a Total War lens, he's by far the most impressive character that comes from Book 4. As I mentioned during the story, this version of everyone's favorite Failseer received the hefty upgrade of having Boneripper go from being a companion/bodyguard to instead a monstrous mount of considerable power. This upgraded the survivability and health pool of Thanquol by a staggering amount, not to mention combat prowess and speed. Boneripper also grants the Unbreakable and Terror rules, with the ability to wield either Warpfire braziers or Warpfire projectors. For Total War, I suspect they'll do a mix and have 2 arms equipped with braziers while the other 2 have projectors. This would allow him to shoot gouts of Warp Flame, identical to the Stormfiend variant, for a shorter range shooting attack, ideal against bunched up enemy units. Magical and fire damage, of course. Then there are the Braziers, which are frankly just obscene. Fucking obscene. On top of granting magical and fire damage, they deal significant damage and improve the weapon strength of Boneripper. I would see him having anti-large damage as well, due to the Brazier's multi-wound effect, which Total War often translates into anti-large. Furthermore, he gained a special rule called Warp Fumes, which dealt constant damage to enemies touching Boneripper, meaning he should have a Mortis Engine effect, where enemies in combat with him take damage over time. There was also another rule named Storm of Attacks, which could be made into an AoE Whirlwind active ability, perhaps, to let Boneripper clear out packed enemies that are just stacked all around him. Then we have Thanquol himself, who is certainly no slouch. An incredibly powerful caster, he had the ability to take spells from all Skaven lores. I would recommend a mixed list from all 3 Skaven spell lists. Perhaps doing Skitterleap, he has to have Skitterleap. Thanquol, if you've ever read any books involving Thanquol, him Skitterleaping is a whole thing and it's a whole part of his character. So even though Graciers don't traditionally know spells from the lore of stealth, Thanquol's gotta have Skitterleap. For the other 5, I would recommend doing 2 from the lore of Plague, 2 from the lore of Ruin, and then of course, Dreaded 13th, because he's gotta have Dreaded 13th. He's the Gracier special character. When it comes to the Ruin and Pestilence spells, I don't think there's necessarily like a gold standard. Off the top of my head, I would probably do Warp Lightning and Crack's Call from Ruin, and then maybe Vermintide and Wither from Pestilence. Maybe? Anywho, when it comes to special rules, Thanquol did have a one called Warpstone Addiction, which makes him immune to the normal penalties for consuming Warpstone tokens. But this would probably be an improved version of the Warpstone token skill on campaign. It wouldn't be an active ability. But then there's the Blessings of the Horned Rat, which on tabletop gave Thanquol a hefty ward save. I believe this will be made into an active skill that grants Thanquol an impressive ward save when the ability is active, and then it, goes on cooldown. When it comes to items, the Gracier brings 2 to the table. First up is his Staff of the Horned Rat, which improves his spellcasting ability. We'll probably do something like lower cooldowns, improve magic power recharge rate, etc. Pretty standard as far as wizards with staffs as a magic item in Total War. Then there's the interesting one, the Warp Amulet, which gives Thanquol the ability to heal, which is just crazy good. I imagine the best way to handle this item would be as either a passive that grants him healing under specific conditions, or an active ability that gives him a small burst of healing, which he can use multiple times over the course of a battle. It wasn't true, he didn't have like actual regen, but he did have the ability to gain a wound every turn as he healed up. So I don't think it just giving him flat out regen would be appropriate. That seems like it'd be too strong. But instead, maybe he heals in close combat, or maybe he heals just a percentage of his health every time you activate it, stuff like that. But yes, he can heal, which is always stupidly good. For stats, Thanquol and Boneripper were quite powerful, but what really sold them was the crazy number of wounds they had due to a combined profile. They had so many wounds compared to pretty much all other characters. I don't see their melee attack and melee defense being especially high, nor would their armor be very impressive, but Boneripper should hit like an absolute truck. And when you consider all of the various gimmicks and special rules that they bring to the table, they should be pretty nasty. With that, we finally arrive at the end of the new units and characters that arrived alongside End Times Thanquol, with some fun story bits kind of explaining them all a little bit. Whew. Anywho, that was a doozy. Easily the longest one, by far, to explore due to all the goddamn variants. So many variants. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this exploration of part 4, and please do let me know what you think of the Stormfiends, Verminlords, and Thanquol down below in the comment section. Are you eager to have these rat boys arrive into the Skaven roster? How many versions of Stormfiends do you think we should have? What combination should Creative Assembly go with? If you had to pick only 2 of the generic Verminlords to represent the unit version and Lord version, which 2 would you go with? Any thoughts on what spells Thanquol and Skreech Verminking should be given? I would very much love to hear all of your thoughts on that and more. Thank you all so much for watching, and a special thanks to those supporting me on my Patreon as well. Keeps me able to buy all these goddamn books I need all the time. I'll see you all again very soon for the next book in the End Times, and what units/characters we may see arriving into Total War from it. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and take care.